everybody. Welcome to another livestream podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Markus Vinzent. And today's topic is about the formation of Canonical Paul. Where did the texts of Canonical Paul come from? How are they connected to Marcion's collection of Paul? And when Marcion's collection of Paul formed, and what we can know about that. So welcome back to History Value Podcast, Markus Vinzent.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me once again. Can you introduce everybody to what exactly is Marcion's Paul for those that have not seen your prior discussions?
Of course, that's a pleasure because to give you a bit of background to that, over the past 3 to 4 years, I've worked on the reconstruction of the Marcionite Paul. To date, we don't have a reconstruction of the Greek text of the Marcionite Paul. Hence, the work which I've undertaken together with colleagues, and we're going to publish the Greek text quite soon for free in digital version, also an English translation for that, and a 3-volume study, or rather a 4-volume, but a 3-volume study first is going to appear next year with Na Franke in Tübingen, where we present the introduction. This is a study of the manuscripts that are available, the variants, and all the rest of it. And then in 2 volumes of the 3, we're going to present the reconstruction together with a commentary on the reconstruction. And why I was talking about 4 volumes is that because I've also written a book where I compare the canonical Paul with the non-canonical, the Marcionite Paul. And that is going to appear with Herder first in German and like the reconstruction. But we are intending to publish both the reconstruction with the commentary and this comparison of the 2 Pauls in an English version later on. Now, Jacob has rightly asked, what is the specifics of the Marcionite Paul in comparison with the canonical Paul? So far, people usually know the canonical Paul. That's a bit easier, and probably I start with that. Canonical Paul, as we all know, or most people know, encompasses 14 letters of Paul, of which, quite interestingly, across scholarship, with the exception of some biblical or biblicistic scholars, it is assumed that only 7 of these letters are authentically written by Paul. And just to mention those, it's Romans, it's 1 and 2 Corinthians, it is Galatians, it is 1 Thessalonians, it is Philippians, and Philemon. Now that leaves us with 7 letters, which are also part of the canonical Pauline collection, that are disputed by scholars today. First, we have the mention of 3 letters, which people call Deutero-Paulines, because they are still close to Paul, but are reckoned to be from the school of Paul rather than from Paul himself. We have Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, which makes the 7 plus the 3, 10 letters. And then comes 3 letters that by most scholars, even more scholars than discredit the 3 letters, which I've just mentioned, the Deutero-Paulines, that discredit the 3 letters and take them further away from Paul. And these are the so-called pastoral letters. That is 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. And if you want even further away from Paul, even not taking Paul into the person that sends the letter, so his name is not mentioned in the last letter, and that's the letter to the Hebrews. While it's being taken into the collection of Pauline letters, has to do with the style that imitates to some extent the Pauline letters, but also because early scholarship in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century already debated whether this letter was or wasn't written by Paul. Some people, even if they disputed Pauline authorship, still reckoned that this letter comes from the Pauline tradition, probably written by Barnabas, as some claim, or by other people. Now, if we take the canonical Paul as we have it today and as it's being discussed by colleagues today, we can see we have those 7 letters I mentioned, plus the 3 still close to Paul, which makes 10, plus further 3 plus 1, which are further away from Paul. So in total, we have a collection of 14 letters, of which half the letters are being reckoned to be genuine and half less or non-genuine at all. It is interesting just on that surface to compare the collection that we know has been credited to Marcion. Credited by whom? We have the earliest scholars that are knowing about the 2nd century and write like Tertullian already in the beginning of the 3rd century, but then also people in the 3rd and 4th century, Epiphanius, for example, in the 4th century. These people, Tertullian and Epiphanius, know that Marcion has a collection of letters by Paul, but that this collection only has 10 letters. Now, strangely enough, for a person who is not only credited with these 10 letters, but where people like Tertullian and Epiphanius claim that this person has taken the canonical collection, neglected some letters, and only retained others. It is interesting that this person, Marcion, was supposed to have retained only the letters that scholars today reckon to have been the genuine Pauline letters, 7 letters, plus those 3 letters which even scholars today reckon to be closest to Paul. So his collection, as we know from Tertullian and Epiphanius, had 10 letters of Paul, and yet he has chosen, according to modern scholarship, the best letters and not the non-genuine letters. This is a fact that hasn't been reflected in scholarship as far as I'm aware, which is astonishing, because you would reckon if Tertullian and Epiphanius were right, that Marcion is a forger or somebody who cuts down a canonical collection. Why would he cut down a collection in a way that makes a collection genuine? And that raises the question whether our witnesses who have an interest in making a claim for the genuinity of the canonical collection of 14 letters, whether these witnesses are trustworthy. If you take trust in contemporary Pauline scholarship, I think the logical conclusion would be that you would distrust that statement by Tertullian and by Epiphanius. If you go along with this kind of an argument, you would then also ask the question, if Marcion isn't the forger and isn't cutting down, but has preserved the more genuine part of Pauline letters and the collection of Pauline letters, including those Deuteropaulines, what about the textual substance of the letters that Marcion has retained in comparison with the less genuine collection of the canonical texts. And again, I think, if we observe the same distrust in Tertullian and Epiphanius, who want to claim that Marcion has not only cut down the canonical collection by 4 letters, but if we also distrust the parallel argument they make, that Marcion has also cut down the texts of the 10 letters of the canonical collection, then we might ask the same parallel question, whether Marcion's more trustworthy numbers collection is not also more trustworthy with regards to the textual substance of those 10 letters. Hence, the question which one might raise is whether, as the canonical redactors have expanded the 10-letter collection into a 14-letter collection, including 4 non-genuine letters, which they, at least the 3 pastoral letters, are passing under the name of Paul, have they not at the same time also expanded the 10 letters themselves in their substance to make a canonical collection, adding non-authentic material to the 10 letters of Paul, in order, for example, that would be one reason, in order, for example, to harmonize the new 4 letters, pastorals and Hebrews, with the existing 10 letters. Or, which could be another reason, for bringing in the theology that's been added by Hebrews and the pastoral letters into the 10-letter collection. What could also raise one more question, whether, because the 14 letters of Paul are part of the canonical New Testament, whether these 14 letters have not been remodeled, and particularly the 10 letters, text being added, just as the 4 letters have been added, in order to harmonize the 10 plus 4 letters with the rest of the canonical texts of the New Testament that were missing in Marcion's collection. Most particularly, of course, is the so-called Prax Apostolos, which we know from Byzantine nomenclature, which means the sub-collection of the canonical New Testament that encompasses Acts plus the so-called Catholic letters. Acts, of course, one of the protagonists in Acts is Paul. From chapters 8 onwards, it is almost exclusively dealing with Paul and what happens around Paul. And so the question is, how do these 4 letters that have been added to the 10 letters and are seen as non-genuine today, how do they relate to Acts? And how do Acts and those 4 letters relate to the 10 letters, which are part also of the Marcionite collection? So maybe that's a start. Probably a last word with regards to dating, according to what we know from our witnesses. Our witnesses tell us that Marcion's collection of his New Testament derived or has been put together and has been published and is also quoted and known by people from the end of the Bar Kokhba War. So we are in the late 130s, probably in the beginning of the 140s. The first time that the 14-letter collection appears to be known, and particularly the pastoral letters and Hebrews, is around the time of Irenaeus of Lyon, which is about 30 to 40 years later. And when you look into scholarship about the reception of Paul in the 2nd century, and I'm not talking about one particular, but all the people who have worked on the reception of Paul in the 1st and 2nd centuries agree on one thing, that there are quotations of Paul in our writings that we know must have derived from let's say the 2nd century at the latest, and at the latest in the 2nd century to the times around or before Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, which is in the 150s, 160s. Then people will unanimously say that the 10 letters of Paul, those letters that we regard as genuine or almost genuine, these letters are known by people, even if they don't quote in reference to these letters. So, for example, if you look into Justin Martyr, who never mentions one of those letters, but still there are reminiscences and hints which people have discovered which refer to Paul's letters, just like Polycarp of Smyrna, First Clement, and others, particularly Ignatius, you might say. Now, they all refer exclusively to the 10 letters, never to the pastoral letters and never to Hebrews. So it seems, with regards to dating, that the 10 letters have been collected at the latest in the late 30s or early 40s, whereas the 14-letter collection is only known and probably has only come together around the times of Irenaeus. Hence, we have an early collection which has been credited to Marcion, and we have a later collection which we know today as the Canonical collection from the times of Irenaeus. So far, the introduction for those people who haven't heard anything from what I was talking about these letters before.
You also wanted to respond to a video that I did recently with Professor Paula Fredrickson. What did you want to say about that?
Yeah, I just listened to that yesterday with great delight. You asked her the question, but please correct me and expand on it with your questions if you wish. One of the questions, the first question I think you asked was about how is Paul dealing with Christ? So what's the position he gives to Christ and with pagan gods?
Yes.
And Paula, if I'm not wrong in representing her view, was that Paul elevates Christ to a high position. It is, if we have it, and as we have it, for example, in Philippians, he is elevated beyond human beings. He's not equated with the Father himself, but he certainly is uplifted above any creature. And then she adds, what's the task with regards to pagan gods of this Christ? And she mentions that, as we have it in Romans 1, that Christ is being seen as a Davidic figure. And she mentions that David is a warrior. And so the idea of Paul was that Christ himself is like David, who is also a prophet, a warrior of the end times. And that this warrior, as we have it then also in 1 Corinthians 15, that this warrior is fighting against the pagan gods, is killing them, is subjugating them, is putting it under the feet of the divine. So has this Davidic role, which also, of course, reminds of the figure, which I would add to that, of the figure of Daniel, and particularly the position and person or the role of the Son of Man, which plays a particular role also in the canonical texts added Paul. So here comes the one who kills and has to kill the pagan gods and the princes and the powers of this world in order to restore peace and the space for human beings and Israel. When I was listening to that, it was clear to me, and which will be part of the book I have submitted to Herder, that the role of Christ compared to what we have in the texts that we can credit to the Marcionite Paul or Paul in the Marcionite collection and the canonical Paul are very different, if not opposite. In the Marcionite Paul, Romans 1, where there is mention that he is from the Davidic tradition, is missing. But different is also 1 Corinthians 15. In 1 Corinthians 15, as Harnack has rightly seen already, the parts that link Christ to that agent that fights the forces of the world, the powers of the world, and kills those people and submits it to the divine, that agent cannot be the divine himself. Well, that's like our reading today too. But the verse just in before, 1 Corinthians 15:23, which makes Christ the agent of war, has been added by the canonical tradition and is missing in Marcion's 1 Corinthians. As a result, the agent for Marcion is the one, the divinely power that has created this world. It is the one person that in other places is even being equated with Satan. It is that one which models itself as the supreme divine, which sits in the temple and claims to be the divine, but in fact is the power of darkness, is the power that fights other powers of darkness and wants to submit it to the divine. So it's not Christ. And that relates to the difference between the pre-canonical, as I call the Marcionite Pauline Paul. For the pre-canonical, the Marcionite Paul, God is the supreme transcendent. Quite different, for example, Marcionite Paul never prays to God directly. God to him is so transcendent, so beyond everything, that people cannot directly relate to him. Hence, here comes the role of Christ. All of the prayers of the Marcionite Paul go to Christ. So Christ has a sort of mediating character. And if we compare that to the Jewish tradition, we can see there's close relation between this idea and this concept with the concept that we have and find in Philo of Alexandria. This divine is so far away that Christ's role, therefore, is this intermediate role between human beings and this transcendent God. But this transcendent God is not the creator of this world. The creator of this world, according to the Marcionite Paul, is this subservient, demonic, satanic power that's created this world and carries out the fights and the killings. Christ, in contrast, is the person that tries to restore human beings. However, as a divine and divinely figure, not as just a human being, but as the one person that wants to rescue human beings, as Paula rightly also said, not as a physical being, but as a almost stoic, sort of physical, but more etherical or ethereal being, restored to the human transcendent being.
Does Marcion's Paul portray Jesus as a Davidic figure in any sense of the manner?
No, never. He is not in any way a Davidic figure, not at all.
How does Marcion's Paul portray Jesus then, in terms of his humanity then, in contrast to canonical Paul?
That's very interesting. People like Schneller and others has remarked that Paul has pretty little to say about the earthly Jesus, which has always surprised scholarship. And we have big debates between Bultmann and others about this kind of a gap of knowledge, at least, as is being portrayed in the letters. We cannot hypothesize what Paul knew outside of what we have in written form. But that has always surprised scholarship. And it is linked to the perspective that we take. If we think the canonical Paul, with its 14 letters, is the more genuine one, which is being even disputed by the fact that the 4 letters that's been added are non-genuine, we can still see that the 10 letters, including the 14 letters, the 4 letters, I mean, the 14 letters have very little to say about Christ as a human being. It knows, I'm talking now not about the Marcionite Paul, first about the canonical Paul. The canonical Paul, Galatians 4, knows this Christ has been born from a Hebrew woman. But, I mean, where should a human being deriving in as a Jew, by whom would he be born? But in addition to that, Paul gives nothing about Christ's upbringing. He talks not about his appearances, nothing about miracles. There are very, very few sayings that are being given, most of them in 1 Corinthians. But none of them are explicitly and literally found in one of our canonical Gospels. There are not more than a handful anyway. And there are a few traditions, as people have collected them, which give us some insights where he relates to the human Jesus. One tradition is, of course, his baptism by John. Second tradition is his suffering. Third tradition is the Last Supper. And a final tradition is probably that a form of incarnation. I mean, Philippians 2 is here in the background. A form of incarnation is being talked about. Potentially even a kind of pre-existence, but that takes us already beyond a human Jesus. And of course, particularly 1 Corinthians 15, we have the appearances of the resurrected Christ, again, which brings us beyond the human appearance of Jesus. Of all of the human data that the canonical Paul gives us, the Marcionite pre-canonical Paul has even less. Out of what we know from the canonical Paul, the Marcionite Paul only knows of sections of Philippians 2. So a kind of incarnation, probably more a kind of appearance of incarnation and elevation. And there is one mention in Laodiceans, which is the name for the letter that we know from the canonical collection as Ephesians. And in Ephesians 4, or Laodiceans 4, we are told about the one God, the one Christ, the one Lord, and baptism. And baptism here seems clear, at least in the Marcionite collection, that refers to Christ's baptism. But the Baptist himself doesn't appear there. From the Last Supper tradition, he also has knowledge, the Marcionite Paul, just like the canonical Paul, with apparently different forms of what's being reported about the Last Supper. And most important for the Marcionite Paul is suffering, and even more important is Christ's resurrection. So this is 1 Corinthians 15. However, it is less the appearances of Christ as the risen than the fact that Christ is the risen Christ. And this seems to be the core even of his Christology. So when we compare now these two, we can see that if, let's say, if the perspectives were the way we know about the chronology, hence to say that Marcion's collection is not only genuine or more genuine in terms of the numbers of letters, but even if Marcion's collection were more genuine with regards the textual content, then we would see that the canonical redactors at the later stage in the 2nd century have added information and also the emphasis on the human being of Christ, just as they have added a closer connection even between Christ and the divine. And more particularly, they have linked the Christian belief and the Christian traditions about Christ with the prophetic traditions and the Torah, hence the relation to Christ, to David, to the Davidic tradition, and also that the God of this creation of this world, the God of the Jews, was the God Christ was talking about. Whereas in the Marcionite, Paul, this Christ talks about a divine who is unknown, who is also unknown to the God who has created this world. Hence this blind, demon-like agent.
How does Marcion's Paul describe James in contrast to canonical Paul? Does Marcion's Paul identify James, recognize James as Jesus' brother or the Lord's brother, or does it not?
He does not, no. He mentions James, one of the very few people he mentions. He mentions James as one of the three in Jerusalem. So he sees him as a authority, but he also sees in him one of the people who try to keep the Christian community in the realm of the broader Jewish circumcised community, which doesn't mean that Marcion himself or the Paul of Marcion would take out Christians from the Jewish tradition, on the contrast, or in contrast. But he sees that there is a Jewish tradition that emphasizes the Torah, the prophets, and the human explanations of the law and the prophets by subscribing and substantiating that these laws, like the preservation of the Sabbath, the observation of purity rites, and of course of circumcisions, are necessary for being Jewish. Whereas for the Marcionite Paul, that is irrelevant. He is not against following those laws, but to him, people who follow these legal obligations, they have to follow it through. But what he is criticizing is that these people usually are not following everything through. And so what he wants to set as a standard for those people who listen to him, to his gospel, to his evangelion, is that they should leave people who want to keep the law, keeping the law, but that the obligation is to love others. And that summarizes the entire law. It even makes people spiritual Jews and not physical Jews. But physical Jews who want to be physical Jews, to the Marcionite Paul, that's okay, but that's irrelevant for his own Jewish community.
Was James Jesus' brother, or is it because he really wasn't, and that's the reason why Marcion's Paul does not identify him as such?
That's a difficult question for an historian. What I can say is that in this early collection of Pauline letters, there is no knowledge that James was the brother of Jesus. It is interesting and it is different in Marcion's collection, where we come to the Gospel of Marcion, where I think the assumption in that Gospel is that he was the brother of Jesus. So if both texts are related, let's say by the same collector, if not by the same redactor, then one would see and say, although in the Pauline letters there's no mention that James is the brother of Jesus, if Marcion were the redactor of both texts, then Marcion would have known and probably would have even supported the idea that James was the brother of Jesus. However, I think the canonical collection and its redactors behind the collection have even a different impetus. For them, the fact that here we have in James the brother of Jesus is a question of authority. Because if somebody like James is in and part of the family of Jesus, his words carry more weight than, let's say, a Barnabas or a Titus or somebody else. And so the emphasis that James is the brother of Jesus is enhanced in the canonical tradition. You can see that, first of all, that within the Catholic letters, the very first letter in the collection is being credited to James. Now, in this letter, There is no mention that James is the brother of Jesus. However, there is a second letter which is part of the collection of Catholic letters, quite rarely read, but important in that sense. And the question you asked is Jude. And in the opening of that letter of Jude, Jude mentions that he is the brother of James and that they are, or he is the brother of Jesus. So we see that the canonical tradition builds around the book of Acts, to which these Catholic letters are then part of as a sub-collection. And they always appear together. So Acts, in the manuscripts at least, that we have from the New Testament, Acts is never bound together, even not in the papyri, never bound together with the Gospel of Luke, but is always bound together with the Catholic letters. And in some of our major codices from the 4th and 5th century, Acts plus these Catholic letters precede in the codex the letters of Paul. And that means that you read first the Gospels, 4 Gospels, then you read Acts, then you read first the letter of James, then you read the letters of Peter, then you read the letters of John. So you have the 3 columns that are being talked about in Galatians. You have those 3 people endowed with letters. That is what the Catholic redaction does. And that enhances the standing of the Jerusalem community in the eyes of the Catholic redactors to make a case with the then following letters of Paul. So right from this design of these codices, in the redaction of these collections, we can see that the authority passes from Jesus, from the Gospels, through Acts, first to those powers of the Jerusalem collection to give them their words, and only afterwards to Paul the Apostle with his letters.
How does Marcion's Paul understand the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection in contrast to the canonical?
If there is an overlap between the 2 poles, that is probably the closest. Because if my perspective were right, and the canonical tradition has taken on board a good deal, if not almost everything, that Marcion's Paul was presenting, the least changes that I noticed is and has to do with regards his death and his resurrection, with the exception, as I mentioned before, that have to do with his appearances. And that difference is not because the Marcionite Paul wouldn't have talked about appearances. On the contrary, to him, the appearance that Paul has, of which he talks right in the beginning of Galatians, and then again in 1 Corinthians 15. So that is not the issue. What the canonical Paul and the redactors behind him have done with these appearances is they have brought it together with their picture of authorizing what I just mentioned before, of authorizing the three from Jerusalem. And that's the reason why Peter becomes so important, both in Marcion's gospel, both in the revision of Marcion's gospel, where in Marcion's gospel, for example, it's the women that go first to the tomb, report to the apostles and are not believed by the apostles. Emmaus, the disciples, they distrust these women. They rather trust the prophets. In the revision of Marcion's Gospel, Luke mentions now suddenly that there is Peter running to the tomb because the disciples don't trust women. So Peter becomes the witness, the key witness for Christ's resurrection. And exactly the same thing happens in the revision of Marcionite's Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. Here, it is suddenly Peter who becomes so important. James becomes important. And Paul talks about himself down. I mean, he's the last lost of all of the witnesses. Nothing of that you will find in Marcionite's Paul. And you can see how the resurrection appearances are being used, or you may say misused, for creating a credibility to Peter, James, and John. I think because in both Marcion's Gospel and in the Paul by Marcion, it's exactly those three, and amongst all three, mostly Peter, who has been discredited by the Gospel and Marcion's Paul.
Who does Paul think had Jesus killed in the Marcionite edition?
I think Marcion's Christ has cured humankind. It is a buying back, it is a catching of human beings in their totality that are being rescued, which includes all Jews, which includes all pagans, which includes every human being. There is no reference to individual curings, except when we look now into Marcion's Gospel. There we have, of course, the miracles and the curing.
Does Marcion's Paul identify who had Jesus executed?
That's a good question. I think to him, it is like in the Gospel. It is a combination between Jews who have killed Christ and the Romans or the Roman authorities, which were behind those killings. But it is also interesting that Tertullian makes in his commentary a big deal that the Marcionite Paul is excusing the Jews by saying the Jews are not responsible for the death. And similarly, I think the Romans either. Why? Because he said, if these Jews and Romans had known the messianic character of Christ, they would have never, ever killed him. And that's his explanation that none of the Jews, and let alone none of the Romans, have willingly killed a Messiah. They were innocent because, in the true sense, they were innocent about his messianic character. Because the prophets, what are being used by the canonical writers, the prophets were not prophesying about this Christ. They didn't know about what was coming. The prophets, just like the Torah, were talking about the Israelite Messiah, which they mistakenly took as a local Messiah. A Messiah, as Marcion says in his preface to his New Testament, a Messiah that was taken as a restorer of the state of Israel. And here you can see why and how this New Testament, with this gospel and these 10 letters of Paul, are a product of the times after the Bar Kokhba War. Because the Bar Kokhba War was the attempt against the Romans to re-establish Israel and, of course, to rebuild the temple as the core of Israel, at the exclusion of pagans, particularly the Romans, at the exclusion of all other Jewish traditions that were not part of this temple-oriented Jewish traditions. And against this type of a revolt, the Marcionite collection emphasizes that there is a Messiah which brings peace and which has a universal task encompassing both Jews and non-Jews.
And in my final question, did Paul write Marcion's Pauline Epistles?
You're dragging me into even deeper waters here. Again, I start with the canonical Paul. We have several mention that Paul wrote these letters by his own hand. All these mentions are missing in Marcion's Paul. So in Marcion's Paul, Paul doesn't write by his own hands anything. But then we have the contrast. In the canonical Paul, most of the time, or very often, is not even the author of these letters. He is co-author. He's the main author, but he has several co-authors. Timothy is the most famous one. In the Marcionite Paul is the sole author. No co-authorship at all. Even no scribe. Now, the question is, of course, is Marcion referring to and making use of an older collection of Marcion's letters, or does he collect these letters himself? Here I have to correct my own earlier views, and the best thing you do in scholarship is if you see and discover your own mistakes. And so the major mistake which I made in the past was that I believed that Marcion was the collector and redactor who was making use of individual letters. The first thing I discovered through my reconstruction, and mainly by looking at the vocabularies and the semantics, the lexic, grammar, and everything else, was that Marcion has clearly used a collection of 3 letters, which is older than himself collecting letters. Now, these 3 letters, by surprise or no surprise, are the so-called Deuteropaulines: Laodiceans or Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. These 3 letters have so often and so many in common with the canonical New Testament, and by which I mean the letters and the writings which are not part of Marcion's New Testament, but also of all these textual editions, for example, of the 10 letters, that we don't find in Marcion's 10 letters, but that we find in the canonical 10 letters. So 3 letters which are related, and I would even say intermediate, between the canonical tradition and the Marcionite lexic and the Marcionite workshop, let's say. I then thought, but those 7 letters were probably collected by Marcion. A second mistake which I made. Because by establishing the reconstruction, I came across Galatians 5:21. And Galatians 5:21 is witnessed by Epiphanius in Greek and hinted at least by Tertullian in his commentary of that letter. And in Galatians 5:21, we are told that Paul has mentioned before that flesh cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Now, Galatians in Marcion's collection is the first letter, the opening letter. So he couldn't have made a back reference to a letter earlier than the first letter. And in fact, this reference, something he has said before, we find in 1 Corinthians 15:50. And there we read the same thing. Flesh cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Hence, it is absolutely necessary that Marcion was drawing not only on a collection of 3 letters for the Deuteropaulines, but that he was also drawing on a collection in which 1 Corinthians preceded Galatians. Hence, it is most likely that Marcion not only drew on a collection of letters that were close in language to the canonical tradition, he also drew on a collection of 7 letters, which most likely had the same order in which the canonical letters of these 7 today are being presented, namely first Romans, then 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and in 4th place, Galatians. And that this is the earlier, I'm not saying the original, but the earlier order in which Marcion found these letters. And all the more important then is that what the redactors rarely do, as David Trovish has shown through hundreds of collections of letters in antiquity, redactors only change the order of what they find if they have an enormous interest, if it plays a big role in their statement and in their thinking. And so that's my reading, at least, that the redactor, whom we might identify with Marcion, that this redactor has placed Galatians first and replaced it with Romans, which then for him only came 4th. That a redactor then omits to revise every back reference or every link is a natural problem. We have it the other way around also in the canonical collection a number of times, that these links are just not adapted and are going into the wrong direction. So this is a typical mistake redactors make. But that answers a bit your question. So I think even if one were to embrace the view that I'm trying to suggest in this reconstruction with my colleagues, then we would need to think beyond the 10-letter collection of Marcion. And even if we believed that the textual evidence that these 10 letters are giving us, they borrow themselves, not just individual letters, they borrow from already 2 existing collections. And both these collections are not entirely separate from what our canonical redactors later produce and later have. And maybe this brings me to also a final observation. Scholarship in the past starting with Justin and Irenaeus, have always emphasized the separation between the canonical tradition and the Marcionite tradition. They have branded from Irenaeus onwards, and maybe already slightly with Justin, they have branded the one side as heretic in order to establish themselves as Orthodox or Catholic. This is still in our heads, in our school books, and in our minds and in our hearts. Even latest Marcionite scholarship, be it Moll, who writes about Marcion the arch-heretic, be it Judith Leo, who has written a remarkable monograph on Marcion, but the title and the content is The Making of a Heretic. To identify Marcion as the one-siding heretic, confronting the Catholics, or the Catholics confronting Marcion and the Marcionites, is, I think, for the early times, misleading. We have apparently a close interaction between the various camps and the various theological schools who rely on each other's work, who might not even, like the people at your channel here, and also the listeners, we might not always agree, but we all live from each other and we borrow from each other and we listen to each other. And if we listen carefully, I think we get a good deal further than insisting on what we think. My experience with the reconstruction is that my colleagues and me were able to correct me. The most beautiful thing a scholar can say.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Markus Vinzent.
Thank you very much for the platform.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.